Effects of child abuse on adult relationships. Why might this be important? It is important to understand child abuse and how it affects adult relationships because you never know who you're going to meet and what their story is going to be. If we are more educated, we will be able to help those in need, as well we will be able to advocate and help minimize child abuse. History of child abuse. In 1962, Dr. Kemp published The Battered Child Syndrome, which led towards the first guidelines for directing physicians to identify and report child abuse. In 1974, President Nixon signed the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act. In 1983 was the first National Child Abuse Prevention Month. In 1996, the first National Clearinghouse on Child Abuse and Neglect website was launched. In 2003, the National Child Abuse Prevention Innovative was launched. And in 2011, the first child welfare was in the news. Different kinds of child abuse. There are different kinds of child abuse that can affect a child and adult differently. The different kinds of abuse include physical, emotional, sexual, domestic or family violence, and neglect. Physical abuse is a non-accidental physical act inflicted upon a child by a person who is taking care of them. Some things, such as a spank or a beat with a belt or broom stick, can be intended for discipline but end up doing more harm than good. Emotional abuse is the most common. This is when the parent or caretaker does not express or show any love, affection, or commission. Sexual abuse is any incident in which a person, adult, child, or adolescent uses their power to perform sexual acts which include both contact and non-contact offenses. Different kinds of child abuse continued. Domestic or family violence is usually a pattern of abusive behavior in an intimate relationship. Most of the time, these relationships end up with one person in charge and others in fear of that specific person. Neglect. Neglect is when a parent or caregiver fails to provide the necessary needs for a child. This has multiple categories, such as physical neglect, medical neglect, environmental neglect, and educational neglect. Physical abuse effects on adults. Adults are more likely to have either violent or aggressive behavior towards others. They are at risk for being shy and wanting to avoid situations which can lead to re-victimization or rejection. Adults might feel that there is threat or violence in everyday situations even if there is not. How physical abuse affects relationships. Adults who have been physically abused are more likely to have broken relationships. If they are violent and aggressive, not many partners or friends are going to be willing to put up with those actions. They also have low rates of marriage. Many partners in the boyfriend or girlfriend stage will not want to get married if their partner is antisocial and violent towards others. Because of low levels of socialization, those who have been physically abused will not be able to form new relationships or make old ones last. Emotional abuse effects. When a child is emotionally abused, there is a high chance that they will experience mental health problems such as anxiety, fear, suicidal thoughts, trust issues, and feeling trapped or alone. Because of all these things, they will also have a hard time forming new relationships. Emotional abuse also creates the possibility of them having psychological or psychosocial problems later in life. How emotional abuse affects relationships. Adults might feel that they are not worthy of a non-abusive relationship. Victims will have a hard time trusting others, which can affect making regular life decisions such as getting a job or making new friends difficult. They also might feel withdrawn, causing them to isolate themselves from friends or significant others, which can cause them to lose a job they already have or for a significant other to break up with them. Sexual abuse effects. This kind of abuse will most likely cause victims to experience mental health and/or physical issues. It can lead to things such as substance abuse, harmful thoughts, and maybe even attempting suicide. How sexual abuse affects adult relationships. Adults who have been sexually abused might have a hard time finding their self-worth. They could also have a hard time recognizing healthy relationships. Triggers could have developed over the years, and it might be hard to know when a trigger will be set off. This could affect a relationship in that if you're doing something with a partner and some trigger comes up, you might act in an unintended way that could harm others. Sexually abused children, when they're adults, can also have things called body memories. Body memories are when an adult suddenly remembers a traumatic event from his or her childhood, and the way the body recorded their experience as a child resurfaces and can cause them to have some sort of flashback. Domestic or family violence effects. Unfortunately, statistically, women are at greater risk for being the victim of domestic violence, while men are at greater risk of being violent in new relationships or just being violent in general. From this type of abuse, victims or bystanders will most likely experience emotional or psychological trauma. How domestic or family violence affects relationships. Children who watch family violence will get the idea that relationships are supposed to be violent and filled with intimidation. If they have an abusive father who is disrespecting the mother, they will be taught that it's okay to disrespect women. If there is always violence in the home while growing up, they will think that violence might be the only way to resolve a problem. Neglect effects. Those who experience neglect as a child are more likely to experience post-traumatic stress disorder and possibly develop depression. They might have a hard time forming attachments not only with adults, but if they were to have kids, those relationships could be at risk as well. Depending on what type of neglect they had as a child, it can affect their brain development, which will cause problems in the future. Types of neglect. There are many different types of neglect. Physical neglect is when someone is depriving the basic needs such as food, shelter, and clothing in a persistent pattern to a person in their care. Medical neglect is when medical care is not given to a child who needs to treat a condition or prevent an illness from worsening. In some cases, if medical attention is not given immediately, the child can face serious consequences or even death. Supervisory neglect is when the adult responsible for a child either does not supervise and keep the child from being harmed or does not have someone watch them if they are not able to. Types of neglect continued. Environmental neglect is the environment in which the child lives is not suitable for someone to be living in. This means that there could be rotting food laying around, infestation of rats or bugs, and children could be sent places in dirty clothes. Educational neglect happens when parents refuse to enroll their child in educational programs such as school. They might do this because they do not want their child to go to school and tell. Emotional neglect is when emotional needs are not met, such as being able to form a positive attachment. How neglect affects relationships. Adults who have experienced neglect as a child will most likely have anxiety when trying to form close relationships. Many are not able to link their childhood with the current emotions towards themselves or others, which can bring a lot of frustration. It can affect overall health, such as their physical and mental health. They might develop eating disorders, they could have substance abuse, and they could also turn violent. This can affect relationships in that many people are going to have a hard time dealing with these problems and will feel helpless unless the victim is willing to get help. If they are on the substance abuse or violent side, it could put other people at danger. How to start healing from childhood abuse. First, you want to be able to admit to yourself that your past might have to do with some of the problems you're having today. Next, if you're able to, get closure. This way, you'll be able to express your feelings about the situation and hopefully be able to move forward. Don't be afraid to do things that make you uncomfortable, such as speaking up and being more social, and also letting go of the past. The most important thing is to remember that you don't have to go through these actions alone, and that there are many people out there who want to be able to help you and support you. Interesting facts. 14% of all men and 36% of all women in prisons were abused as children. About 80% of 21-year-olds who were abused as children meet criteria for at least one psychological disorder. Children who experience child abuse and neglect are 59% more likely to be arrested as a juvenile, 28% more likely to be arrested as an adult, and 30% more likely to commit violent crimes. More interesting facts. According to the National Domestic Violence Hotline, nearly 1 in 5 women, which is 18.3%, and 1 in 71 men, which is 1.4%, have been raped in their lifetime. A child witnessed violence in 22% of intimate partner violent cases filed in state courts. Finally, one study in North America found that children who were exposed to violence in the home were 15 times more likely to be physically or sexually assaulted than the national average. Finally, these are some local resources. La Clínica de Familia, La Piñón Sexual Assault Recovery, and La Casa are just some of the local resources here in Las Cruces that are able to help with current abuse or helping overcome past abuse. Conclusion. Not only is it important to understand child abuse as a whole, but it is also just as important to understand how it affects children when they grow up. Adults can be affected from child abuse in many ways, so it is important to understand that abuse can be physical, emotional, sexual, witnessing domestic violence, or experiencing neglect.